Okay, so we've talked about learning styles, we've talked about study environments, and now we're going to talk about teaching style. So, students aren't the only ones who have a learning style, right? So, your professors also have learning styles. So, let's take a look at what this means for how we teach, okay? So, a teaching style is the manner in which your professors, your instructor teach. And we have all sorts of teaching styles. I'm not going to name them all, but we have lecture and large group discussion, small group discussion. There are instructors who focus on reflection. Some faculty have a visual focus and others have a verbal focus. There can be logical sequence, random sequence, there's debate, there's all sorts of ways in which teachers can get across the information. But what I want you to remember is that your teachers, your instructors, your professors tend to teach their teaching style how they themselves learn, their learning style. So whenever you see an instructor teach, the way in which they're teaching is usually indicative, is usually reflective of how they themselves learn. So if you have an instructor, for example, who uses a lot of visuals, they're always referring to the textbook, they have an overhead document camera and they're showing that, they're drawing images up on the screen, they're always referring to maps and diagrams and images and charts and even memes and anything, videos even, then that instructor probably is themselves a visual learner. And you might have another instructor who is very hands-on. There's very little time where you're just sitting and listening, for example, but you're up and you're doing and you're interacting with models or charts or diagrams. So that instructor is probably more of a tactile instructor. So try to remember that teachers tend to teach how they themselves learn. So you can predict your professor's learning styles based on how they are indeed teaching you. So how does this impact you? So the key, guys, is that sometimes your own personal learning style will actually match or mesh with your instructor's style, but sometimes they won't. So if your learning style does match the teacher's style, everything's great. You're in the catbird seat. It's fantastic. But what happens if your learning style doesn't match the teacher's teaching style, right? So you have a couple of options. Number one, you can quit and drop the course. We've talked a lot in this course about, you don't just shut down in things. We usually have to learn and grow. So maybe the second solution's a little better, and that is that maybe you need to adapt to a new learning style. Maybe you need to start trying things in a new way so you can learn differently. But a third strategy is also not only adapting, but maybe you can sometimes ask the instructor to actually provide some, maybe in class if possible, and if not out of class, kind of strategies that actually match your learning style, to provide some kind of out of class methods that can actually aid in your learning style. So please try not to do the option of I'm just going to quit, I'm just going to drop out, because there's no learning in that process. You're not growing, you're not changing, you're not adapting. Now, it is great to adapt completely, but of course you do have a learning preference, so it'd be nice to have some tools in your toolbox to help you in your learning style. So I think a combination of adapting to the teacher style while also still holding on to your own learning style and coming up with some strategies or some ideas that the instructor can work with you to help you in your own learning style is probably one of the best solutions that you can make. Now, lastly in this lecture, I would like to touch base on two different types of learning that you may be doing in your classrooms and in your study times. And one of the types of learning is called surface learning, and the other is called deep learning. So we're going to define each one of them and see how they're different. So surface learning means that you're basically studying the minimum of what needs to be learned, right? You're relying primarily on rote memorization, often at the last minute, which is called cramming. You're usually doing it as a form of extrinsic motivation, probably coming from grades. You're usually in a really big hurry to do it, so speed is important. And I call surface learning risky learning because, in fact, maybe not a whole lot of real learning is occurring, and you're much less likely to succeed if you're practicing surface learning. Now, there's also deep learning, and that means that your goal is to truly understand the course material. You're actively engaged in creating the learning experiences, and because you're engaged in them, you have better memory retention. You're not really relying on that extrinsic motivators of just the grade, but you're actually enjoying the process of learning for, learning for its own sake. And deep learners tend to use more thinking skills, right? So in all cases, you want to try to avoid that surface learning and actually focus on deep learning. And we've talked about this before when we looked at, the difference between mediocre, average, and excellence, right? If your doctors and lawyers or anyone you rely on only focus on surface learning, there'd be a lot of problems, right? And so we want ourselves to focus, and we want everybody in our environment to focus on deep learning. Now, lastly, you're probably sitting here like, why is this picture of the ocean sitting here on my screen while Dr. Bean's talking about this stuff? And I always say, if, as an example, if I wanted to get to know the ocean and I practice surface learning, it's essentially taking a little net and going out and scooping up the top millimeter, 2 millimeter, 3 millimeters of the surface of the water, and my telling you about the ocean from just skimming the surface. But to actually know the ocean, you not only skim the surface, but you dive into the deepest parts of the ocean, down into the deepest trenches that go down deep into the earth. As high as mountains go up, the trenches go down, and you go into that and you explore all the nooks and crannies, and then you come back and you tell me what you know about the ocean. That's deep learning. And obviously, who's going to know more about the ocean? People practicing, with the little net on the surface, or people diving into the deepest parts? And obviously the answer is students who are practicing deep learning. Okay guys, here's our review. We talked about learning style, and that is the manner in which we learn, how we learn. We can learn cognitively, how we take in information, which we have, visual learners, auditory learners, tactile learners. We actually can theoretically learn by smell, olfactory learners, and by taste, gustatory learners. We can also take in information cognitively. We can also learn by giving out information expressively. So we can be written expressive or oral expressive. And we can also have different social styles of learning, whether we learn best alone as individual learners, or we learn in a group, obviously group learners. We also talked about study environment, and that's the actual physical surroundings in which we learn, in which we study. We could say where we learn, and it can be impacted by a lot of different factors, and we need to analyze those factors so we can pick the best quality of environment for our quantity of studying. And we also talked about the fact that teachers have styles too. Teaching style is the manner in which teachers teach or how they teach, and the teaching style oftentimes mimics the professor's own learning style. So make sure that you as a student are being adaptable and flexible, but also capitalize on your strengths as well, and try to come up with strategies that you can use in all of your classes that actually tap into your own learning style. And lastly, we talked about the two different types of learning, surface and deep, and the fact that we do definitely need to focus on the deep learning and minimize the surface learning.